Center is dedicated to promoting understanding, bridging divides, and building relationships amongst people across religious, cultural, ethnic, and social lines through educational and experiential activities. We'll be offering more information about our work later on this evening, and after our featured address, there will be a panel discussion, including thoughts by Seattle area faith and community leaders, and then an opportunity to hear responses to questions that you may have. Index cards, if they've not already been provided to you, will be for that very purpose. You'll get a chance to write down your questions and then pass those to the ushers in the aisles later on. In late January, I spoke with a friend who noted the readings at a synagogue on the night of January 20th were strikingly appropriate to the day. To paraphrase, if I may, a new king arose and he said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them, so they may not increase." So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them. Ruthlessly, they made life bitter for them. That book of Exodus reading may have been set thousands of years ago, but it seems as descriptive of the changes set in motion that inauguration day in Washington, D.C., as it did in ancient Egypt. In the introduction of his New York Times best-selling book, America's Original Sin, our featured guest quotes Jesus in John 8:32. "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." He then points out that the truth is not meant to make us defensive, dishonest, deceptive, bitter, or angry. That if the untruths we allow ourselves become our idols, they separate us from God as surely as they separate us from each other. Jim Wallis has authored an impressive body of work in addition to America's Original Sin, including God's Politics, The Uncommon Good, The Gospel Brings Hope to a World Divided, and The Great Awakening. He does regular columns for Huffington Post and Time.com, but he has also, in a very real sense, authored numerous movements for putting faith into action for social justice. He is the president and founder of Sojourners in Washington, D.C., a nonprofit, faith-based organization, network, and movement aimed at achieving exactly that end. He is also a public theologian, national preacher, and international commentator on ethics and public life. He teaches at Georgetown University, has taught at Harvard, and served on President Obama's first White House Advisory Council on faith-based and neighborhood partnerships. All of what I mentioned is just a sample of Jim Wallis's service and ministry. There is no one better suited to welcoming Jim Wallis than my friend and spiritual guide, Father William Treacy, the co-founder of the Treacy Levine Center. If any period mirrors the fear, the anger, the unreason, the willingness to hurt the helpless, the stranger, it was the 1960s. That's when Father Treacy, a native of Ireland, and Rabbi Raphael Levine helped launch a program called Challenge on KOMO TV, applying the lens of faith to questions of social injustice and intolerance. Together, Father Treacy and Rabbi Levine founded the Treacy Levine Center, which continues the mission of bridging divides and building relationships. Work, by the way, he continues to this very day at, for him, the youthful age of 98. Please welcome Father William Treacy.
Thank you all very much, ladies and gentlemen. My name is William Treacy, and I did found Camp Brotherhood 51 years ago with the late Rabbi Levine. He died in 1985, but we carry on his vision to promote unity and harmony in the human family. It's for that reason that we invited Jim Wallis to speak to us tonight. In 1965, a group of courageous people marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, risking their lives for the right to vote. Among the 600 people who marched that day was an 11-year-old girl, Joanne Bland. And recently, I saw a picture of Joanne. She's almost 70 today, and she's still active in seeking civil rights and promoting harmony and unity in the human family, which is what Treacy Levine is for. Dr. Martin Luther King, of course, was in that group in 1965. On March the 7th, 2015, 50 years later from that march, a group of the original marchers, like Representative John Lewis, who was beaten at the time, so much so that the day they marched, we know as Bloody Sunday, the way they were treated. About 17 of them had to be hospitalized due to injuries received from violence the day of that march. This is what some people are willing to do to promote unity and harmony in the human family. We should be eternally grateful for their courage. On March the 7th, 2015, along with our speaker tonight, Jim Wallis, was President Obama. He gave one of the finest speeches, I'm told, of his term in office that day. This is what he said. What greater expression of faith in the American experiment than this? What greater form of patriotism is there than to believe that America is not yet finished? That we are strong enough to be self-critical, that each successive generation can look upon our imperfections and decide it is in our power to remake the nation the more closely with our highest ideals. As a priest, I would say that statement applies to both church and state. Each of us in our generation has to see what can we do to make it a better place. So tonight then, after his lifelong struggle for peace and justice, I'm going to ask Mr. Wallis to tell us, what bridges do we need to cross today to achieve our highest goals?
'98. Father Treacy and Rabbi Levine, we are very grateful for what you started a long time ago to do this kind of work, bringing faith groups together. In 1960, you were way ahead of your time. And you remind me, just as I was listening to you, of a story from Washington when I remember a number of us as church leaders went to the rotunda of the U.S. Congress to defend the poor from budget cuts. We said a budget is a moral document. Years ago, a rabbi friend of mine said, Jim, I know this is a lot of church leaders and evangelical preachers and Catholic sisters and bishops, but do you have room for a rabbi? And I said, sure. In fact, our text is Isaiah chapter 6. Woe to you legislators who pass infamous laws denying the poor of my family their rights. And so he came, the rabbi came, and he read that text on the floor of the rotunda. And we're all arrested and went to jail. And after we were in jail for a while, I saw the rabbi and a Baptist preacher sitting on the benches, and they were having a rigorous theological dialogue. Rigorous. And it hit me. This is what we need to do. We need to be arrested for our faith and discuss our theology in jail. Well, tonight I'm so blessed to be in. I love Seattle. My friends here who know me know I love this city. Lots of friends here. And I feel blessed to be with you because it's a Saturday, and normally that wouldn't have been possible in the old days because, among the other things, the kind words that you heard, I was a Little League baseball coach for 11 years, 22 seasons for my two boys. And my commitment was no speaking on Saturdays anywhere else because we had games to play. Now one's a college baseball player, one's a high school ball player. And so I'm just a fan now and more free to come to places that I love. But I was thinking about that today, and it reminded me of another story. So one game, I'm coaching one of my guys, and the team, well, it didn't look good. Fifth inning, we're down 5-0. The top of the order, some of you know what I mean by that, had just gotten up and they hadn't gotten any hits. So here we are, last chance, and it was the bottom of the order, and we had a Little League that wanted everybody to play. So some kids were really good, and some kids weren't so good. And it was the bottom of the order with the kids that, well, they weren't stars. And two of them got on base because the pitching was so high they couldn't even leap to hit the ball. So they got walked, due no fault of their own. They just got walked. And then up comes Stefan, the last hitter. Now, Washington, D.C. has a lot of international families, and this kid is a Brit. He doesn't have a clue about baseball, not a clue. But somehow, the ball hit the bat. And Stefan ended up at second base, and 2 runs scored. But because this kid's a Brit, he's very polite. And he walks over to shake hands with the shortstop. I said, Stefan, you got to go back to second base. He runs back. He says, I've never been here before. Stefan began our rally, and we won 10-5. And after the game, I always have these reflection times with the guys, the boys, of how baseball teaches lessons of life. The parents kid me and talk about my post-game sermons. And I asked, what did you guys think? What happened today? One of them said, sometimes you get what you need from unexpected places. Another one said, all of us were a part of this. It took all of us to win today, all of us. And then the third comment was, it just goes to show you, you can never give up on hope. I was doing a seminary commencement that weekend, and I used that quote, and I said, you're graduating from seminary, your vocation is about hope. Hope is our job in the faith community. It's one of our most important jobs. Movements have always needed people of faith for that particular purpose of bringing hope to bear when no hope is seen. We're in a time of great polarization, of a lot of fear, of a lot of hate. And people don't see much evidence of what we are here to talk about tonight, building a bridge to a new America. And I want to say to you tonight in Seattle that I think 2 things are at stake as we gather here in this wonderful place tonight. 2 things are at stake. One is literally the soul of the nation is at stake. Who are we? What kind of nation are we going to be? It's our soul as a nation, as a democracy, that's at stake. The second thing at stake tonight is the integrity of our faith. The integrity of the faith commitments in this room, which are diverse, many, some clear, some just kind of seeking. I've got supporters of Sojourners who say, I'm an agnostic on my good days. But I keep hanging on to the possibility of faith making a difference. The soul of the nation is at stake tonight, and so is the integrity of our faith. I met with a number of your clergy this afternoon, and I said, finally, these issues are not just or even primarily political. They're deeply theological. They're about what we say we believe. As Christians, Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, people of faith, they are about what we say we believe about our faith. It's whether we believe it or not. We say it, but do we believe it? This will be a test of all of that. Let me just start with how this applies to Little League baseball coaches. Every black player I ever coached, every single one of them, had the talk with their dad or their mom. The talk. How to behave in the presence of a police officer. What to do with your hands and not to do with your hands. How to look, eye contact. What to say, not to say. I don't know. I don't know a black dad hasn't given that talk. All my players had that talk, all my black players. None of my white players or their even liberal white parents in Washington, D.C. have had that talk with their baseball players. Most don't even know what's going on, the talk. So I started to ask my white parents and grandparents to have that talk with their kids about what was being said to their teammates by their dads and moms, their classmates, what they were hearing about law enforcement in their lives. First they said, well, that'll really upset them. I said, yes, it will. Yes, it will. That's the whole point. Because if you've got athletes as kids, you know, often their best friends are their teammates. So when they hear what is being said to their teammates and classmates, it'll upset them. They'll think it's wrong. They'll want to stop it. They'll want to change it. Is the old talk acceptable to us? Or is there a new talk we need to have? And where will that talk take place? In our congregations? Coffee houses? Thanksgiving family discussions? Where will that new talk take place? What's at stake? It's the soul of the nation and the integrity of our faith. So I hope that tonight, when we have an amazing panel. I've just been with some of your local leaders, and we're going to have a whole panel discussion about this tonight. We're going to have the talk here in this place. We're going to hear from you, questions and things you want to ask. We're going to have that talk here. But I hope you don't all walk away saying to yourselves, those things are terrible. I'm really against all that. What a terrible situation we're in. No, I'd rather have you move into a process we call in the faith community of discernment. Discernment. What are you going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to say that we're not saying now? What are we going to speak that we haven't yet? Where do we break the silences all around us? Where can we make a difference by speaking and acting and intervening? Intervening in that old talk, particularly those of us who are white people. What are we going to say, do, when, and where? How can we help build a bridge to a new America? We're facing so much. We'll hear some of that tonight. There are 800,000 young, undocumented immigrants, dreamers, some of whom have worked for us at Sojourners, one of whom swam to try and save people in Houston and drowned, trying to save somebody else's life. 800,000 people who are living in fear and terror now. They were hoping they could help their parents. Now they're looking at what's going to happen to them. Then there was Charlottesville, where angry young white men who call themselves Proud Boys took off their sheets and marched full of fear and hate and violence, shouting things about Jews, about blacks, about people of color. Clergy called me from that church where they were having a vigil, and they were terrified. Torches coming toward the church. They didn't know what to do. And then Houston, just a few weeks later, where I saw a woman after she was rescued. She says, people that didn't even know me took care of me. Didn't even know me, and they took care of me. There were people saving the lives and risking their lives for people they didn't even know. Or a terrified older white woman literally on the steps of her house, water coming up past her waist. She was just terrified. And I saw the CNN scene where this very strong, large African-American man walked right up to her and turned around, and she leapt on his shoulders, and he piggybacked her out to safety. And no one asked her how she voted. Or the amazing story of this young martial arts heavyweight champion, I think he was, and he was rescuing people. And I want to get this quote here. He says, I picked up one guy and his family, his wife. He just kept apologizing to me because all he really had were his clothes, and he wanted to take his Confederate flag. He wanted to take that with him, and he just apologized and said, man, I'll sit in the back of your truck, man. I don't want to have my flag inside your truck. I'm so sorry, man. I'm just... and his wife kept hitting him, saying, why don't you leave that damn thing at home? And the rescuer said, man, I'm not worried about that. I'm just here to rescue you. All kinds of rescuing across racial lines, religious lines, all kinds of lines. I saw a guy say, I just couldn't keep watching people suffering on television, and I had a boat. So I just took my boat. An armada of boats went out because people saw what was happening to their neighbors. Houston, one of the most diverse cities now in the country, they saw what was happening to their diverse neighbors, and they said, I got to do something. I said today to your group of clergy, part of the problem is we don't see what's happening to our neighbors in all their diversity because of all of our racial geography. We don't see it or know it or understand what's happening every day. why those black baseball player dads have to have that talk with their kids. We don't see it, but they saw it on TV and they acted. And does it take a disaster like that, or how about the disasters happening every day in the lives of vulnerable people? Moms and dads too, and I love being a dad, but I've noticed when moms especially, when moms start talking to each other about their hopes and fears and dreams for their kids, it's really a bonding experience for moms to have that talk with other moms about what they want to see and what they're afraid of for their kids. But that doesn't happen very much across racial boundaries, racial geography. That's not accidental. That's policy. Housing policy, zoning policy, educational policy, gentrification. We're not hearing and listening to each other's stories. Houston, they broke through that. So I hope that people like us, people like you, and particularly those of us who maybe thought in Charlottesville, those white supremacists who are marching, I'm not like them. They're not like me. I'm different. There was a lot of focus on white supremacists. There wasn't so much on white supremacy, which is underneath so much in our society, even the talk that baseball dads have. So, one question you will ask, people always do, what do you mean, Jim, original sin? What is America's original sin? Well, it's a lot more than slavery. That's too easy, especially for us white folks. Because, my people weren't here, and they weren't slave owners, and we came later, and as I say, blah, blah, blah. It was I'm a Christian, we Christians, British and American. And here's what we figured out. We figured out that you can't do to indigenous people and to kidnapped Africans what we were doing, the most important economic resource in the American nation was free labor, slave labor. You can't do that to people if they were people made in the image of God. You can't do that. It's called imago Dei, image of God. So what we did with our slavery, there were other slaveries before, other indentured servanthoods before, but what we did was we created this myth, this construct, this lie, this ideology, this idol of racial difference, racial superiority, white supremacy. We just made it up. We just made it up. We Christians made it up because we couldn't deal with what we were doing to God's children. In Genesis 1, it says, let us make them in our image, after our likeness. Now, we said, and this isn't just old history. I was in Ferguson marching with some kids, and this young African-American kid, in the middle of the night, he says, I still existentially, he's being chased by the police, feel like I'm treated like I'm 3/5 of a person. That was written in the Constitution. He still feels that way, marching in Ferguson. What's at stake here is our souls, particularly those of us who were Irish and German and Italian and Swedish and came here and all became white people. We weren't before, but we came here, and that was the promise. White identity, white normalcy, the normalcy of whiteness as an idea. Somehow, this is the promise. White identity politics, racial difference. racial superiority, white supremacy, and idols, as we know as people of faith, separate us from God. That's what they do. So listen carefully now. White Christianity, my tradition, white Christianity is an idolatry that separates white Christians from God. So what's at stake is our soul, is the integrity of our faith. And too often, particularly in progressive places like Seattle and Washington, D.C., racism is about somebody else's problems, and the racial minorities, they have these problems, and we can help fix them and use our influence. No, it's about our sense of ourselves and who we are as the children of God. So, after Charlottesville, I thought of some things that we, particularly in predominantly white churches and congregations, could do. And there are five things, they all begin with the letter P. Pulpit. I've got a friend who's a father, a professor at Fordham, teaches there, Brian Massengale. He tells me that he always asks his white students in his classes, have they ever heard racism named and called a sin from their pulpits? From their pulpits. Almost always the answer is no. Well, what would it mean to, in all of our pulpits, to historically find out if that's ever happened from the pulpit of your church, historically? And there's all kinds of denominational histories, and Georgetown, where I teach, has finally faced up to the fact that Jesuits at Georgetown sold slaves to pay for Georgetown. And they're dealing with that now in our university. Confederate windows just taken out of the National Shrine in Washington, D.C. What would we learn about our pulpits and denominations if we ask, has slavery ever been named as a sin from the pulpit? Many things are named as sin from the pulpit, but has that ever been named? What would it mean to move into that process if congregants require their preacher to do that, say that, research that? What an experience that might be for us. What is this sin? Let's name it. 2, pulpit, penitence. Now, I was just talking with a rabbi you're going to hear from later about repentance, this word in our traditions, Christian, Jewish, Muslim. The word doesn't mean feeling sorry or guilty or just shame. That's, again, too easy for us who are white folks. Feel guilty and shame and then go home and watch television. The word repentance means turn around. You're going in the wrong direction. Turn around and go in a whole new direction. Turning around is a very different thing than just feeling guilty and sorry. If indeed this notion of white identity and white superiority and white supremacy, which is white supremacy is a blunt way to say white privilege, if that's underneath our systems of criminal justice and policing and economics and housing and gentrification, if that's underneath, what does it mean to turn around that in those systems where many of us work and live and have much of our being? Turn around is what it means, going in a whole new direction. What if there were penitential acts of reading and listening and learning and dialoguing with believers of color, accepting and joining black leadership in the churches and society, and together identifying and embracing key issues of racial justice in our communities, as I met people doing here in Seattle this afternoon. Repentance means also, like in the cathedral or Georgetown, repairing the breach, like Isaiah said. Isaiah 50, repairing the breach, reparations. That's where the word comes from. Repairing, even from our profit from slavery and white supremacy. Pulpit, penitence. 3, pastoral care. Many of us from the white churches and society and schools need pastoral care for being morally compromised, infected, diseased by the sins of white supremacy. What does that mean to look at even those young white men marching in Charlottesville as people in need of pastoral care? What does that mean to recover from this sin, this disease that we have been so infected by? Prophecy. How do we not just say, I'm not like them? How do we say, how is this underneath this white supremacy, underneath so much in America, and find the courage to confront it, take it on, say it out loud? Voter suppression, racialized policing. If Jamal wants a job and Harry wants a job and they send in their applications, Harry gets more responses back than Jamal. Or if they go in for interviews, what happens? Jamal doesn't get called back as Harry does. This happens not just in Alabama, in Seattle, in Washington, D.C. These are everyday occurrences. I don't know any black parents in America, I don't know any who aren't afraid of their kids walking out the door in the morning to go to school. I was asked by one of your radio people here this week for an interview they're going to play. I'm not sure if they did, but she said, "What do you mean white privilege?" I said, well, when my son comes home from school, he's with his friend, one of his best friends, teammates, Cam, who's African American, Cameron and Luke, and they're going to do homework for a while and then go to practice, and they both know that Cameron is less safe walking out any door in D.C. than Luke. Or if my son Luke, who's 6 feet tall, big, strong athlete, to be honest, if we're all being honest, if my son Luke had been in Sanford, Florida, and did everything Trayvon Martin did, the same things, exactly the same things, everyone knows he'd have come back to me in joy. But Trayvon didn't come back to his parents and now isn't in college like my son is, because Luke wouldn't have been followed, wouldn't have been profiled. Safety that we assume. How do we change policies, practices that exemplify what that really means? Pulpit, penitence, pastoral care, prophecy, and changing policy. Who are we as a nation? We saw hate in Charlottesville. We saw hate that made many people uncomfortable. And we saw some love in Houston that really made many of us hopeful. But how do you move from just rescuing people, rescuing each other, to inviting your neighbors, your diverse neighbors, into your homes? Play dates with your kids, school, congregations. What does it mean for moms to have that talk about their kids? What does it mean to understand the dangers that happen every day to families right now that don't know if they'll still be a family by tonight because of who could get deported? What does it mean to have that kind of relationship? I think, as I said to the clergy today, I think we have this moment of opportunity. Could even call it the Trump opportunity. To go deeper into our faith. What do we mean by faith? Go deeper into our faith. What practices, disciplines, time, prayer, silence, to go deeper into whatever it is for us is faith. To go deeper, that's an opportunity. To go deeper, as this event shows, in relationship to each other across our boundaries, our racial boundaries, our religious boundaries. To go deeper into all those relationships. And 3, to go deeper into relationship with those who are most in trouble, imperiled, impacted, assaulted. The text that brought me back from the student movement back to my faith was Matthew 25, where Jesus says, "It was me. It was me. I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was naked. I was a stranger, immigrant. I was sick. I was in prison. It was me, and you didn't care. Lord, when do we see you? Hungry, thirsty, naked, stranger, sick, and in prison. If we had known it was you, we would have at least formed a social action committee." But we didn't know it was you. "As you've done it to the least of these," he says, "you've done it to me." It was me. I never heard anything that radical in Karl Marx, Che Guevara, or Ho Chi Minh. So I signed up. Now we have a Matthew 25 pledge and project that is giving toolkits for how to build relationships between churches and mosques, how to build those, to go deeper in those relationships, how to support and stand around and bring undocumented people into our lives, our homes, our churches, our seminaries, and say, you're going to go after them, you're going to have to come after us first. How to go to our police chiefs and sheriffs and say, here's my collar, here's my card. We want to help you with community policing. We really want to help you become not warriors, but guardians of our community. We want to help you do that, but you know what? We're going to watch you. We're going to watch how you treat young people of color in this town. We're going to watch you. Matthew 25. So, how do we make the hope real? How do we love overcomes hate, our traditions say, but that means you got to really go after it. You got to really go after the hate with love. Love is what will change it, but how do we go after it? How do we go deeper? So there's a image that was raised here by Father Treacy about the bridge. I was on top of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and I got to march up that bridge with literally the foot soldiers who had been there 50 years ago and who had risked their lives on that bridge. And because of what they did at Selma, we had a Voting Rights Act 5 months later. Because of what they did, they risked their lives. And I'm on the bridge now with John Lewis and all those in their walkers and their wheelchairs. And I asked myself, they crossed the bridge and they got voting rights. What's our bridge? What are we going to cross? What are my kids, what's going to be their bridge? What do we cross? What's that image? What's that metaphor for our bridge to cross? What does that look like to build a bridge to a new America? To realize that in 20 years, we're no longer a white majority nation. We're a majority of minorities, and that political fact is underneath everything in our political life. That's underneath all of it right now. How do we build that bridge? Or the metaphor I shared today that is a new one for me is from Valerie Kaur, a Sikh woman, who at a watch night service this New Year's Eve, she said this: maybe the darkness we feel all around, and that night a lot of folks were feeling darkness all around, an election and all the rest. Maybe the darkness we feel is not the darkness of the tomb. Maybe it's the darkness of the womb where we are birthing a new American nation. The darkness of birthing a new nation, and maybe what the midwife told me as I just delivered my first little brown boy. She said, just keep breathing and pushing. Breathing and pushing, and we'll get there. I like to lift up those images, a bridge and birthing a new nation. We are not, in my view, yet an exceptional nation, but we could become one if we became a nation where becoming a majority of minorities wasn't a problem, but was an opportunity and a gift that we have always had at the heart of this nation. So I want to close with a hope story, because I'm trying to say that our job is hope, even in times like this, when we don't see much evidence around of hope, at polarization, anger, hurt, violence. With a number of young people I was talking to today, Desmond Tutu kept coming up. And they're asking me, how I knew him and how my contact with him in South Africa. So I want to end with a story about Desmond Tutu. So back in the days of apartheid in the 80s, there was a desire to link American churches with South African churches and collaborate, us to support them in trying to throw off apartheid. It was a very dangerous time, very violent time in those days. So I was invited to come to South Africa, but I couldn't get in because my name was on all their security lists. But I got snuck in by World Vision, who has an office here in Seattle, who didn't check their visiting pastors. So I was a visiting pastor. And I couldn't be met at the airport by any of my friends, so I went to St. George's Cathedral, having been snuck in to unite with Archbishop Desmond Tutu and all the other leaders of that movement. And I came, and a rally had been called for that cathedral and just canceled. The cathedral, St. George's, is much smaller than this great auditorium. It's a little place. And so Desmond said, well, we're just going to have church then. Try and cancel that. Well, they didn't want to cancel church. So here's Desmond Tutu preaching. He's a little man, flowing robes. Looks a little bit like Yoda. He's sitting there and he's preaching. And I'm huddled there in the crowd, just arrived in South Africa. There were 3 times as many troops and military police on the outside as there were worshipers on the inside. It was designed to make us afraid. It was working with me. They're all around us, totally surrounding, and he's preaching. All of a sudden, they break in the doors in the back of the cathedral, these South African police and military, and they literally stand along the walls of his cathedral with tape recorders and notebooks in their hands, saying, in effect, we're taping you. We're writing down what you're saying, and you just got out of prison. We're going to put you back into prison. They were saying to him, we own this country. This apartheid system says we, white people, own this country. We own this place. We own this cathedral. We own you. We own your religion. We own your God. That's what they were saying. He stopped preaching. He bowed in prayer, and we all were wondering, what in the world was he going to say? Finally, he looked up and he said, you are powerful, very powerful, but you're not gods. He did that wonderful Desmond Tutu smile. You're not gods. Sparkling eyes, then began bouncing like a good preacher from Atlanta, Georgia, and he says, so, since you have already lost, we invite you today to come and join the winning side. And we danced out of that church led by the young people. Then 10 years later, I'm back at the inauguration of Nelson Mandela. Guess who the master of ceremonies is? Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I said, Bishop, do you remember that day in St. George's? Remember that day? And he smiled. He remembered the day. I said, you said they all joined the winning side, and because that day, that new day, that inauguration, you couldn't find one white South African who hadn't always been against apartheid on that day. Desmond taught me that optimism is different than hope. Optimism is a feeling, a mood, a personality type. How do things look today? How's the weather? It's going to get worse in Seattle now, I know. How's it look now? Hope is not a mood or a feeling. Hope is a decision you make because of your faith. It's a choice. Hebrews says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. What I learned from Desmond Tutu and the faith leaders in South Africa, and they were Christian and Jewish and Islamic, and Nelson Mandela thanked them and said, we couldn't have done this without you. They understood that if you're going to be at the party, the inauguration is great to be there, 150,000 South Africans, I was there, it was wonderful, but our job is back at St. George's, where you can't even see the party, the celebration, except through the eyes of faith. He could see that they were going to win, but no one else could. And so he had that faith back then. Then he says, bet your life on your faith. Bet your life on your faith. And so it's like how faith prompts hope, that prompts action and makes change. That's always how it happens. Faith, hope, action, and change. So we who believe, we are all the children of God. And that makes us very special, and maybe even a more special nation, that we have gifts, we have possibilities we've never even known before, that this problem is really something that gives our faith a purpose, to build that bridge, to birth a new nation. Because my best paraphrase of that text in Hebrews, faith, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, is the word I'll close with. Hope. Even in a volatile time, disturbing time, angry time, fearful time, hope means believing in spite of the evidence, and then watching the evidence change. Thank you very much.
Did each of you get an index card? Raise your hands if the answer is yes. This is audience participation. We're going to get there shortly. If you did, if you've written down a question, please pass it toward the aisles. The ushers will be coming along shortly to collect those. And we are going to have a portion of this program that's going to be an opportunity to hear some of your questions addressed. Before we get to that, though, we are blessed to have a distinguished panel of Seattle area faith and community leaders. Each will offer some thoughts on tonight's topic of race, white privilege, and building bridges, participate in a conversation with Jim Wallis and each other, and then respond to your questions. But first, some introductions. You've already met Mr. Wallis. Immediately to his left, Aneelah Afzali is an attorney and the executive director of the American Muslim Empowerment Network, a new initiative of the Muslim Association of Puget Sound. She serves as a governing board member of the Faith Action Network and as director of legal clinic at the Muslim Community Resource Center. Her work with faith and non-faith communities has helped to build bridges of alliance and to combat Islamophobia with facts over fiction, faith over fear, and love over hate. Estela Ortega, immediately to the left of Aneelah, is the executive director of El Centro de la Raza, a Seattle-based civil rights, human services, educational, cultural, and economic development organization. Her distinguished career of political advocacy, service, and community organizing has been recognized by awards too many to name them all. She is responsible for the development of Plaza Roberto Maestas, a $45 million community-inspired, transit-oriented, affordable housing project. And we know, given real estate in Seattle, that is badly needed. Senior Rabbi Daniel Weiner believes passionately in building Judaism for the 21st century and in healing the world through social justice. His leadership at Temple de Hirsch Sinai has brought growth and innovation in worship, rabcasts on video, and a rock band he leads in Rock Shabbat services. I've heard him. He's really good. Weiner wrote, "Good God, faith for the rest of us," about the dangerous polarization between fanatical faith and soulless secularism. He and his team won the Fane Award for their campaign for gun responsibility. Next is Pastor Kelle Brown, who has served as lead pastor of Plymouth Church, United Church of Christ, since 2015, and sees Plymouth as a progressive voice of inclusion to all people. Focused on social justice, she believes in engaging in hands-on ministry to the least and the last and the most vulnerable. She served previously in Seattle as pastor for Mary's Place and in Richmond, Virginia, at both Woodville Presbyterian Church and in a ministry serving the homeless. Pastor Terry Kyllo is director of Neighbors in Faith, an interfaith effort to recognize Muslims as neighbors and partners in building a more peaceful world, authorized by the Episcopal and Lutheran churches in Western Washington. He is the author of 2 books and the recipient of several awards, including the Faith Action Network Interfaith Leadership Award in 2016 and the Interfaith Leadership Award from the Muslim Association of Puget Sound in 2017. He serves as president of the Treacy Levine Center Board of Directors. We thank each of you for participating tonight.
So what does all this mean for Seattle? They're going to help us. I don't know. You all are leaders here, and you all live here. So between this panel and you all, we're going to take a shot at what this new talk means in Seattle. It's already going on. I know a lot of you are doing this already. So Aneelah, I mean, you know, all this, if faith doesn't make a difference in the world, what's the point, right? So from your perspective as a Muslim woman, and what we're in right now, facing in this country, what does this mean?
So in the name of God, most merciful, most compassionate, I just want to say it's such an honor to be here with all of you, and want to also recognize that we are on indigenous territory. So thank you for that question, Jim, and I loved your book, by the way, and your talk. Faith has to be put in action. Right? And this is a mandate, this is a commandment in the Quran for us, and I know it's true for other religious scripture as well. You cannot have faith without action. So as if we just say, you know, my faith says one thing and that's separate from what I'm required to do, then that is not, I mean, in the Quran, repeatedly, righteousness is described as not just sort of the faith part, but the action as well. It has to come with it. And there are commandments in the Quran, like one that I love, which is posted at Harvard Law School even, and it's one of the greatest manifestations of justice out there, where it says, "O you who believe, stand firmly for justice, even if it be against yourselves or your parents or your relatives, whether rich or poor, because God is witness to all." So this is sort of what our faith traditions teach us. And it's important, I will say for myself as a proud American Muslim, for me to recognize that mandate of justice, to recognize that I have to have the action bit, not just the faith bit, and to speak out exactly as I am commanded to do by the Quran. And one of Prophet Muhammad's favorite quotes of mine that I love is where he talked essentially about racism. In his final sermon to his community, what he said was that he specifically told his community that that an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor does white have superiority over black, nor black over white, except by piety and good deeds. So again, you got to have the faith and you have to do the good deeds to follow it.
So it's not just enough to believe. You got, "Oh, you who believe," says Harvard, you got to stand firm for justice.
Yes, absolutely. It's a mandate and it's a commandment that I take to heart. And I think it's really important, especially at this time in our nation's history, to really stand for justice, as all of us have to do.
So I don't know about you, but when I heard what Estela Ortega, all that she does, I thought, you're like doing everything that people, your center is doing all the things that people need, which are not often done in the society, particularly people who are on the margin. So you're doing practical work every day that impacts people's lives. So what does all this conversation mean for you and your community day by day here in Seattle?
Thank you very much for the question. First of all, I also want to thank the audience. Buenas noches, good evening. I send you a strong embrace of friendship and love. I also want to have you know that 16 de septiembre, the September 16th, which is today, is Mexican independence from Spain. And throughout the world, Chicanos, Mexicanos are celebrating Mexican independence because we want to hold on. We want to make sure that our children know their history, that our culture is practiced, and that we are passing this on to generations to come. Reverend Wallis, thank you so much for your labor of love in writing this book. Your message of action and hope is exactly what we need at this time as we face the difficulties as people here in our nation. I just briefly want to say that El Centro de la Raza translates into the center for people of all races, and that is extremely important to us. As a Latino organization, we obviously target the Latino community, but we know that it is morally right when you provide the kind of services that El Centro provides, is that we need to be open to everyone who needs a helping hand. And October the 11th of this year, we will celebrate 45 years of what we refer to as building, well, what Dr. King referred to as building the beloved community. We have worked day in and day out in multiracial coalitions, organizing. We know how important it is to build relationships and practice unconditional love for all people. We were taught by the Nicaraguan Revolution, by Father Ernesto Cardenal, that those of us who provide services to our community to ease their pain and suffering, that we should be trying to create a heaven on earth. And that's what we're trying to do at El Centro de la Raza. Our movement has worked very hard to build this beloved community. And now we're being threatened by forces that are powerful, but we also, as a people, have more power than those forces, and we just need to organize ourselves. Never did we imagine in our country that we would face a period of such division in the 21st century, and consequently, what this means to our communities. Yet, we have been there before. And what do I mean by that? As a country, we have faced dark chapters in our history. Many have been dehumanizing and shameful. Often these horrifying actions were permissible by the law in their time. The near Holocaust of Native Americans and the theft of their lands, the slave trade, the Trail of Tears, the robbery, which we don't often hear of, the robbery of half of Mexican territory, Chinese expulsion, Operation Wetback, and the internment of citizens and non-citizens of Japanese descent during World War II. The struggle that we face today is not only about rounding up 11 million undocumented people, even though 5 million children in the US have parents who are undocumented, and the 800,000 DACA students that have worked very hard to get educated and follow the rules and hopefully wanted to become good citizens are keeping Muslims with the pretext out of our country because they are supposedly potential terrorists. So it's not only about that, it's also about eliminating low-income housing, job training, food assistance, legal services, destroying the environment, eliminating the arts, and even public radio, just to name a few. Building unity between races must be deliberate. And Jim talks about that in his book, and it must be deliberate on a daily basis. Our democracy and our Mother Earth needs this commitment from us. In Jim's book, he writes that proximity is the key to understanding where we live, where we spend our time, where we work, where we volunteer, who we know, where we become involved can change the geography of racism. Because it is about relationships. The personal and family contact breaks down bias and stereotypes. I agree with this, and our movement calls upon our white allies and every single person in this room to put your sentiments into action.
Absolutely.
Work on local issues pertaining to policy that harms communities of color. 81% of Americans believe that prejudice against minority groups is very serious. And Americans also believe that President Trump is doing more to divide this country than to unite it, and encourages white supremacy. I am inspired by the way, in particular, white women are resisting all over the country and in our region too. Many people are standing up for the first time in their lives, standing up with the conviction that they must do something to fight for democracy. We need to be involved in conversations with each other, to support each other's issues, because they are connected and impacting us all in one way or the other. It's not about making the choice of what issue is more important over another, like I've read sometimes between the wall or healthcare. We must stand together to protect and defend all of our communities. This will mean increasing the work that we are already doing, apply even greater pressure, march in greater numbers, which we have been doing, shout louder, and if necessary, be prepared for civil disobedience on the scale of Standing Rock. I invite you to visit El Centro de la Raza. Know that you are welcomed. As long as needed, we will continue to fight for freedom, justice, and equality, and our right to inclusion and belonging in this country that belongs to us all. And we invite you to be a part of that struggle with us. We need you in that struggle. We need to work together to make the changes to build the beloved community. Thank you.
Thank you. You raised the issue of proximity, which we'll get back to in that conversation. So, Rabbi, why does a rock star care about these kind of issues so much? When we were talking earlier, we talked about how our mutual friends, David Saperstein, Jonah Pesner, the Reformed representing Washington, D.C. for your community, always goes back to the scriptures. It's not just a political argument. It's a scriptural, a faith argument that goes underneath all of the partisan wrangling and saying, what does it mean to be a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim? What does that mean? So I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and particularly to respond to your statement and to your wonderful book. I was particularly impressed with the way in which you leverage faith as a way to break through white defensiveness. Even well-meaning, well-intentioned white Christians in particular will respond differently when confronted with scripture and with text. And in particular, I like the idea of understanding what repentance truly means. And you went back to the Jewish scriptures to understand it, because repentance is one of those squishy words that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. From a Jewish perspective, and I'm thinking about it a lot this week because our high holidays come this week and I'm pretty busy thinking about these things. But repentance, the Hebrew word for repentance is teshuvah, which literally means to turn back, to turn around, to turn to the right path, to turn to God, to turn to one another. And there are three key steps to teshuvah. It's not enough just to say, as you said, I feel guilty, I feel bad about it. With teshuvah, first, you need to be aware of the sin that you've committed, the mistakes you've made, and you have to confess them. In Judaism, unless you confess them publicly and in a group of people, it doesn't count. Secondly, you need to vow to change. You need to take that awareness and you need to take that confession and you need to make a promise to do something different in the future. And the most important part of repentance happens not during the synagogue service, not when you're just here with a bunch of like-minded people, but months, weeks, years later, when you're confronted with the same opportunity to do the wrong thing, you choose to do the right thing. And within this country in particular, there are two key things that I think are ways in which our teshuvah, our repentance, will truly be borne out and will truly be realized. First, we need to have in this country a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It needs to be something that is sponsored by the government, and it needs to be something that we embrace. And secondly, we need to have a serious and a public conversation about reparations in this country for the African American people. And for all people, we're talking specifically about the original sin. I think for everyone, you're absolutely right. There needs to be reparations. There needs to be facts on the ground. You talk about scripture in the book of Exodus, that wonderful metaphor that so many oppressed peoples use. When the Israelites on their way out of Egypt, guess what God asked them to do? To go get gold and silver from the Egyptians. And that God was going to incline the hearts of the Egyptians to give that as the beginning of a recompense for slavery. And we need government to help God out a little bit here and to get that message across. And we need to do those kinds of things if we truly are going to repair, if we're truly going to engage in what my people call tikkun olam, the repair of the world. We need to start with repairing that original sin that you have talked about so explicitly. Thank you.
Can I hear an amen to the rabbi? Amen. Now, Pastor Kelly Brown, my intuition is you know these issues pretty well. Brittany Packnett, who is one of the promising young leaders out of Ferguson, a Black Lives Matter leader, a black woman who's really showing the way, she says, we need more than allies. You were mentioning allies. We need accomplices. Accomplices, more than allies, accomplices. So what does that mean? What these issues for you are a daily pastoral occurrence in the families of your parishioners. So what does that mean in your community, and what does it mean to be accomplices?
The interesting thing is I'm an African-American woman who is the lead pastor of a dominant culture church. Right. Plymouth is mostly white. So the interesting thing is that it is not a concern for most of the folks for which I am their pastor. It's a concern for me
Yeah.
It's a concern for my daughter.
That's right.
It's a concern when I send her to go to school at University of Washington, and I tell her, you make sure you drive the speed limit, and you make sure you stop at the stop signs, and you make sure that you have Progressive insurance card on your phone so that you can pull it up, because I want to see you home tonight.
Right.
And so my attachment to this is because I come from the Deep South. And I know, even having been born in 1972, what it means to look at the ground or get off the sidewalk because there is a white person walking by. And so my concern today is I'm grateful that you are doing the work that you're doing to bring this conversation and make sure that we know it's a moral prerogative to engage in this conversation, and that this is just not something about, well, I haven't burned a cross today, or I haven't called someone the N-word, so I'm safe. I'm really wondering what it will take that people will have the investment to become accomplices. I wonder what it will take to know that we must go beyond saying, well, we're safe, we're Seattle, we're nice, we're civic-minded, we're okay here. But see, I found out when I came here in 2003 about the red line that slides all the way through your beautiful city, where black folks had to live on one side of it and not on the other. And I know about from the newspaper, one of the first, from the black newspapers, one of the first things I saw was the number of African-American men who had been shot in the back, running.
Right.
And so there is a problem here. And so making it particular to Seattle, my ask of those who attend Plymouth, and my ask of you, is that you determine how to diminish the need to stay safe. What is it that will make you step forward? Because it is not my conversation. I have to go out into this world and determine how to be safe myself. How is it that I'm supposed to carry the burden, the conversation for you? The interesting thing is that I take on the conversation with great deference and love, because I know that, I believe in the words of Howard Thurman, who in the 1940s created a multiracial church in San Francisco. So he was way before his time, trying to do what was right. But in one of his books, he said he believes that we are longing for one another. He believes that we are brothers and sisters. And the angst that we feel, the anxiety that we feel, is really the longing for each other and the recognition of the loss. What we have lost to not be in right relationship with one another. And so what I am asking of all of you is, it's okay for you to feel ashamed or to cry tears, but that's not worth a hill of beans for folks who look like me. At the end of the day, I am asking that you allow whatever faith expression that you claim, for it to lead you towards transformation, so that you might allow for those feelings to turn into some kind of right action, so that when you go into your workplace, you will ask why there are not enough African Americans or Latinos or gay folks or transgender people working at your organization. You will wonder why your salary is more when your supervisor is a woman. You will ask those kinds of questions. You will wonder what your house, or how you got the house that you're living in, if it's in the central district. You'll wonder about how the people who were pushed out of that neighborhood, where they went. We don't just want to live in Federal Way in Kent. It was affordable. You will ask the questions. And so that is what I think we're here to do today, to not just simply say, well, we're okay. We have black friends. I have a black grandson. You know, I go to Ortega and I give of my time. All of the things that we do that remind us that we're okay. This is not an intellectual exercise. What we're doing is not about what we know. It's not about how many Jim Wallis books you have in your library. So what if salvation is real for you, the salvation will not be at the library. It will be in your broken heart that will allow you to change and to do something other than just hoping somebody else will take this on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
In these moments, I'm reminded of the Good Samaritan. And oftentimes we have this rubric that gets us out of being accountable all the time. It's so interesting how good we are at doing that. But I love the story of the Good Samaritan because really what it is pointing to, one of the things that it's pointing to, is that when you pass a situation, when you see someone who's down, when you are aware of a circumstance, guess what? You are accountable in that moment. So I don't know about you, but it's not for me to say, well, I'm going to call an organization to come and see about this guy on the corner. I need to tend to that person as best I can in that moment. It's not enough for you to drive by an African-American male who's being pulled over by the police. God is saying, you stop and you be a witness so that person might go home to their family tonight. We are called to something more than just trying to learn about this situation, because while you're learning, many of us are stepping on the oxygen tube while we're trying to breathe. And so it is important for us to understand that you have but one short life. As Mary Oliver would welcome, what will you do with it? I pray that you will change and be transformed by the words, but also by whatever sense of a higher power that you honor, so that we might change this world, because I believe it's possible. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm struck by the way you put together. Some of us are unsafe on the streets just because of the way we look. But then others who are safe on the streets because of the way they look, when they challenge those systems, they become unsafe. You become unsafe when you challenge those systems. And then you start to understand how safety requires acceptance or agreement. And when you challenge, what would those cops do if, some white motorist stops by and say, I'm just checking it out? That's a whole different kind of conversation. Now, Terry, you are the chair of this organization that is sponsoring tonight.
Yes.
That started in 1960 with a priest and a rabbi, and now you're taking that forward to now. So what does all of what we're talking about tonight mean for you and the organization and all the groups you work with right now in the city of Seattle?
Well, I grew up in Eastern Washington, and after church on Sunday mornings, we go outside and stand with the men. After you got old enough, you go stand with the men and talk about all kinds of things, like when to plant the crops and how the weather was and wheat prices. And almost always the conversation would go to race. And a conversation after we listened to good sermons on Sunday morning and sang beautiful hymns. And as the Sunday school happened, we'd sing, God loves the little children, Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, right? And we go out there and we talk about race, and it wasn't race that was any way I'd want to talk about it. My grandpa came to the U.S. In an 18-foot handmade wooden boat from Norway with 12 other people. It took tremendous courage for him to get in that boat, because there was a promise he heard that you could come to America and you could get free land, because the Homestead Act took the land away from Native peoples and gave it to anybody who looked like me. Now, I don't know if my grandpa knew that the land was being taken from Native peoples. Maybe it was invisible to him, maybe it wasn't. It was certainly invisible to my family because we never talked about it. But as I sat out there one day on my mother's funeral, we had buried my mother up on the hillside behind the church in land that used to belong to the Palouse Indians. And I went down and I stood in the circle with the men, and they knew I was a pastor. And they began to talk about people of different races. Because I think after you know you've taken something from somebody, after you know you've benefited from their suffering, you know, all of us want to think that we're good people. And so we can't stand the thought that those are actual human beings that we hurt, so we have to dehumanize them. And so I'm standing out there aware of where I'm standing in a circle of people that I've known since I was a little kid. And I started hearing the N-word and talk about Mexicans and talk about Native Americans. And I stood there in that circle and I said, you know, I'd appreciate it if we wouldn't talk about our fellow human beings that way. And I had to say that on my mother's funeral day. So I was raised in white supremacy. Not the overt kind, necessarily. Like, I don't think anybody in my family would want to hurt anybody. But I was raised with the notion that if you're white, you're kind of a little bit better. And I knew that when I left my hometown, even though I was from a family where there'd been a bankruptcy with a mother who had had a chronic illness, and we were often scapegoated and put aside for that, I knew that once I left my hometown, that I could go to college and no one would know anything about that, and that I'd be a white guy. And I knew that my friend Jose, who was a pitcher on the baseball team, would not get to leave with that same opportunity. And so as a white person, this conversation does make me feel a little bit bad, right? And maybe it should. But you're right, feeling bad ain't enough. And I just want to say, I think that my faith tradition teaches me that we're justified by grace, which means that God loves us and affirms us as we are out of God's free choice and not because of something we do. And if I believe that, that means that I get to claim that I'm wrong and that I'm part of systems that are wrong. I'm part of systems that are oppressing other people and giving me advantages at their expense. So that justification isn't just like a free get out of jail card for me, it's an invitation into a more complex world, into a more painful world. And what I want to say to my fellow white people today is, come on, white people, we can do this. Right? We can learn to live in a more complex world. We can look at the past and at the current realities and say, yes, this is a broken system that is happening here. But we do not have to live this way. We do not have to live this way with each other. We have forgotten what it means to be human, what it means to see each other as human. And we have to know that when we get into that state, as Jim said, we don't just lose the neighbor that we've othered, we lose ourselves. So I just want to, what this means for me, Jim, is a more complex world, a world where I have the awareness that I have so much to learn. And I have a long way to go as I start marching across that bridge. And I'm thankful for my sisters and brothers who journey with me.
Amen. You know how most of us can remember our parents telling us things like, not to live in a lie? Not to live in a lie? White supremacy is a lie. So we white folks have been living in a lie for a long time. What does living in a lie do to you, right? For me, I was a baby boomer. So my father gets back from World War II, a naval officer, and he gets a GI Bill, which is free education, and an FHA loan, which is our first house. When you get education and a house, you're middle class. My government made this white baby boomer middle class. Now, the black GIs coming from World War II did not get FHA loans or GI Bills. The guys that served on my dad's ship with him, same place, doing the same thing, same risk, they didn't get that. The neighborhood I lived in Detroit was like every house was a 3-bedroom ranch house headed by a World War II veteran, and they're all white. These things are structured. They're not just attitudes and ideas and let's just change our attitudes and our feelings. These are structures. Like what happened to your family when they came and got the land, and we got a GI Bill and a FHA loan, and that was the beginning of my family's economic life.
You know what that was, Jim? That's white affirmative action.
Well, it was
decades and decades before we've been talking about it for black folk. That was white affirmative action.
And it was a bigger affirmative action program than any of the affirmative action programs toward African Americans. It was a bigger program.
Yeah. And can I address this idea of this lie of white supremacy? Because it is a lie. There's no doubt that this illusion of superiority of a race is a lie. And the reality is that that comes at the cost of black and brown bodies being assaulted, being scared, being threatened, being killed, being oppressed, and all kinds of things. And certainly white privilege exists. There's no doubt about that. And white communities have historically and continue to this day to benefit from these structures, from these institutions that continue to give them reward. But here's the reality too, that I don't think gets talked about often enough. And that is that this whole notion of white supremacy also hurts whites. Mm-hmm. It's not just that it hurts the victims, like the black and brown bodies. It hurts white people themselves. And I'm talking about spiritually, as we talked about, knowing that it is this ideology that separates you from God. So we certainly have that spiritual component where white people themselves are getting hurt by white supremacy. But in addition to that, these structures, these institutions that oppress, as long as those exist, we actually none of us are free. There are some who benefit, a very few, the top 1% or whatever, who may benefit. But the rest of us, we are actually separated from the possibility of uniting and really being able to liberate all of us. So this ideology of white supremacy, in fact, hurts the overwhelming majority of all people. Mm-hmm. And this is why I actually love what I'm seeing now. And this goes to this idea of hope. I see hope around us. Mm-hmm. And this comes in part because of my faith tradition that teaches me hope and optimism, but also because of the young people out in the streets. Because of this new racial justice movement that we are seeing, through this sort of Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, Water is Life, and other movements like that seek to remove and dismantle these systems of oppression. And by doing so, go to the roots of racism, go to the roots of white supremacy, and in fact seek to liberate all of us. And the sooner and better all of us, every single one of us, recognize how these systems are connected, how there is this intersectionality that ties my struggle to your struggle, to your struggle, to your struggle. The sooner we are able to see that, the sooner we are actually able to unchain all of us. And this is why, for me, as an American Muslim woman, I know that whether it comes to my race, gender, religion, any of those parts of my identity, for me, myself, to be free and liberated in our great country, I have to fight for Black Lives Matter. Because I have to be willing to stand up for our undocumented sisters and brothers.
That's right.
I have to be willing to speak out against homophobia, speak out against transphobia, stand united against all of these systems that oppress any group, because an injustice against one truly is an injustice against all of us. And in fact, this liberation movement that we're seeing, I think best exemplified through the movement for Black lives today, You know, the platform that they are presenting really is an intersectional approach, really is a transformative change approach that seeks to eradicate and dismantle systems of oppression as opposed to just the sort of symptoms of racism that we have seen historically. And the sooner all of us come on board with that, the sooner we recognize that all lives cannot matter until Black lives matter. And that's why I have 2 t-shirts that say that, because that message, I think, is one of the most important messages we need to hear and have right now.
Do we have some questions?
Yes, we do, and Jeff Renner is going to come out and present them to us.
You know, we've had one powerful sermon after another.
Absolutely.
You know, this is
I'm ready
right.
for an offering after Rabbi.
And you know, my tradition, the altar call.
That's right.
Usually, like the altar call is okay. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Come forward. What are we going to do? Yeah.
Lutherans don't do that.
Lutherans nod their heads and agree.
Well, I think we're ready for the question period. First of all, at this time, you'll have that opportunity again. Let's have a big round of applause of appreciation. And I think appreciation for all of you that chose to spend your evening this way with all of us and to send forth some impossible to include questions, because there were so many good ones. But we're going to try to sample at least some of those. So question number 1, Jim, you are speaking to the people who largely already share your ideals. How do you reach the people who don't agree with you?
Well, briefly, 2 things. One is sometimes when people say, you're preaching to the choir, I want to say, yeah, but sometimes the choir is really important. To act on what we say we believe. You know, it was never, during the Civil Rights Movement, it was never even a majority of black churches who were engaged at the core. It was a critical minority who risked everything for that movement. So part of it is, I want to look at the people who say, I agree, but what are we going to do? What are we going to do becomes the question. And I think there are a lot of people who, in a new generation, are really wanting to step up. And what really impresses young people is, I think, compassion and courage. They want their lives and their faith to make a difference. And they have to, but unless we show that courage, then they'll just keep feeling bad about the way things are. That kind of choir doesn't help. Committing to do what it will take to change it is what, in fact, we need right now.
On the next question, and I would invite any of our panelists to hop in as you feel so moved. The next question is, perhaps we could begin by no longer using white or black as a name. Why not simply human or American? Any comments or perspectives on that?
Yeah. So, I believe one of the myths of Americanism has been this melting pot. And it's been sort of, well, let's just make everybody the same. You know, like saltless grits or oatmeal with water. You know, just make everybody bland and everybody the same, and then we won't see difference. But you know, you can have 5 white women around the same age come into a room, and within 5 minutes, someone's going to notice a mole, or another one's going to notice that their shoes are different, or whatever. I mean, there's something. There's a sinfulness implicit in our eyes. So I know it feels like the impetus comes from a good place, but I believe we are called to see people as unique and particular. Because if we just say him or her or whatever, there's already issues with that around gender identity. But beyond that, we have not yet seen each other. We've not yet heard each other. We don't know how to listen to one another. If we jump to that level of saying that we have done the work, which we have not, we are already made invisible, many of us. How in the world will we ever be invited to the table? How will we ever get the microphone? So I know it sounds like that would solve all of our problems, but America has been very good at what it's been doing for a long time. And we've got to undo where we are. And it's going to be by seeing each other for who they are without wanting to change them, without trying to see them with our own mirror. I don't know that would work, and I certainly would not welcome it.
And I would add to your point, Pastor Kelle, that this idea of the melting pot, really, there's certain people only that melt, right? The melting isn't everybody. That uniformity, the grits, it's not so much grits, it's everybody becomes sort of, the paradigm. But besides that, this idea essentially of a colorblind society, to let's focus on humanity and human race as opposed to the actual different races that we have, that would work if we had a clean slate.
That's right.
Right? If we started fresh without the systems of oppression built on race, that would work great. I wish we could do that. That's what Islam teaches, right? That this is what we have in my teachings and historical teachings. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that's what he taught us. From my perspective, these are what we should be doing. But unfortunately, that's not where we are. So if we now try to change the game and really focus on a human race as opposed to all of these racialized categories that have been used as systems of oppression, what we're really doing is saying, we don't want to deal with that.
That's right.
Right? So it's not that color blindness would work. It wouldn't. We know we see race. We've been conditioned to see race for so many different reasons. And race is so integrated in every aspect and every sector of society that we cannot just turn a blind eye. And that's what the colorblind argument really is about. It's kind of saying, let's ignore all the disparities on race in education, in housing, in healthcare, in media, in every single segment of society, and let's just talk about human race. Well, that's really the melting pot, and only some people would be melting then.
That's right.
And maybe a biblical note in multicultural churches, and there are more than ever, but there's still only 13% of the churches still. But there's, in the conversation, people always say, well, Christians were first called Christians at Antioch. That's often said. And Antioch was where this church became more multiracial. Different races joined in that level playing field. But all these ethnicities and races at Antioch were all weak. They were all weak, and there was a dominant Roman power. That was the issue. There's a dominant white race, and the effort to be colorblind always comes from that sector.
That's right.
Right. So it's at Antioch. These were all ethnicities that were socially, politically weak and came together to strengthen each other. But they had this Roman dominant culture. There's a white dominant culture. And now, if you look at the church globally, the heart of the church, where the church is rooted in population now, is not the United States or Europe. It's in the middle of Africa. And the global church is becoming that multiracial community. But so we're headed toward the future, in the churches, we're headed toward the future of the church, which is already happening globally. But this white dominant culture is sort of an American heresy, you might say. So that dominant culture is something that the dominant race wants to let's not talk about that. When if we don't talk about that, we're never going to be free the way you're calling us to be free.
If we may perhaps go on to the next question, How do we approach a Native American community that continues to distrust us because of what we have done to them? Whoever would like to address that.
Who would like to take that on?
Well, as a person who's benefited directly from the land being taken away from Native Americans, the first thing that folk got to do is start showing up to powwows. So everywhere I go, and I work across Western Washington to try to help people become better allies for Muslims. But in a lot of our communities, there are no folk who are Muslim in those communities yet. And so every time I do, I figure out what's the native tribe that's close. And I say to the congregations, do y'all reach out and ever go out and get to know the leaders of the tribe? And have you ever gone to the powwow and just sat there and kept showing up for a couple years? And of course the problem is, the answer is that almost never does the congregation has the congregation done that. In Marysville a number of years ago, there was a shooting by a young man at the high school, and I was a part of an effort to put together a healing service for the community. And I was having trouble finding Native people who would be willing to come and pray. And so finally I was getting desperate. I was dreaming about this at night. And I called up one of the elders in the community and I said, I hate to impose on you, but I'm really struggling to find someone who will come and pray, because we can't have this service if there are no Native Americans able to speak and pray at this event. But right now, they don't trust me enough, because I'm new to this community. They don't trust me enough because of all the history to come. And I told him, I said, I'm dreaming about this at night. And sometimes it's disturbing my sleep. And he said to me, if you're dreaming about it, it must be important to you. And I said, it is. And he made a few phone calls, and we had a prayer drum that night. We had a drum prayer that night, and we had several other Native people come and speak that night. And so the reality is, like I said earlier, when you've taken stuff away from someone, you want to ignore them, you want to avoid them, you want to dehumanize them. We all need to get off of behind our TV sets and behind our TV screen and just go start hanging out and trust that the Spirit will make something happen.
Yeah.
My grandchildren are part Native American from the Muckleshoot tribe. And so it's very close to my heart in terms of having grandchildren who are Native American. And also, many Mexicans are also indigenous people. Right. And when I referred to earlier that half of Mexico was stolen, and those states include Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Louisiana. All of that was indigenous land. And so I just want you all to know that. But one thing I think that is really important, and it's coming up, Columbus Day. In our city, we recognize that as Indigenous Peoples Day, and I'm glad that we're doing that, and how each of you could play a role is finding out. There are celebrations with United Indians of all tribes that's located in, I can't think of the neighborhood, where they do have an event to honor Indigenous Peoples Day. The city of Seattle has an event. And so being involved in community, getting to learn about other communities, it requires work. So you need to go find out, where is United Indians? When is the event going to happen at the city of Seattle to honor Indigenous people? And in some ways, when you show up, you're acknowledging the pain that has been there and ready to accept the truth And so when Native people, Indian people see that, relations will begin to change. And you're right, a lot of Native people don't trust white people because there is an agenda. And right now in particular, with the tribes that are in the area, they have the casinos, and so they're doing well. And everybody and their brother wants to talk to the Muckleshoot, the Tulalip, this tribe and that tribe, because of the resources they have. And the tribes know that. They know that. And so to begin to build trust is that you've got to interact and show up to the different events like the powwows, etc.
I simply want to caution the showing up, because I think it is important and it can be helpful, but I also want to say that we need to learn how to center the other, because there's still a whole lot of arrogance and entitlement in showing up to other people's stuff, particularly if you know they don't trust you. I'm really taken that Rabbi Daniel lifted up the reparations piece, because for me, I've heard all my life, the one who has pushed me and propelled me into ministry is here tonight, and I'm so grateful, my grandmother Dorothy Price. And I've heard all my life that the devil is not creative. The devil will continue to do the same things over and over again. And so one thing we're called to do is to be creative. You know what? Why don't you co-sign on a mortgage for a Native person? Instead of wanting to go dance your feet off with them, how about you do something to improve and share power with the Native people? This is the piece that I lose a little patience with. I don't find us very creative. And we have the ability to do that. And we don't have a sense of Isaiah 40, where it's like, what does it mean to raise the valleys and to lower the mountains? What does that equity look like? It looks like something other than saying, oh, I'm really cool because I ate Vietnamese this week. That's amazing. I love fry bread. We have to go beyond people of God. There are folks right here, you can build trusting relationships with people, but it's going to be, God is asking something of us for our souls to be laid bare before those who we want relationship with. And so I am able to be at Plymouth Church as an African American woman, not because they hired me, but because they have already been doing the work in terms of anti-racism. And I found that I could be safe there because they're already engaged in the work. And so I think it is important for us to show up. But I also know that we are sick with appropriation, where we take the culture of other people and don't ask, and then think we are being allies. We have to learn, I will say white people have to learn, I say we because that's my pastor thing, but white people have to learn how to center the other so that you are not central. We are still fighting, is the earth flat? Is the universe surrounding the earth? And whiteness thinks it is the sun. But we have to show that it's the other. It's also in rotation in this universe. And so I just want to say that whiteness must find the power of hesitance. That's right. Where it shares the mic, where it shares the podium, where it shares its resources, so that you will get the gift. That's the piece about it. Terry and I were talking about Family Guy, the deep theological stuff.
It was good.
Yeah.
He was good.
And what I was saying is that Brian and Stewie, the two characters, the baby and the dog, were having a little spat. And so Stewie did something particularly terrible to Brian. So for the rest of the episode, Brian was just pretending like he was going to hit him back. Just like, oh, you're quiet and safe? You know, here we go. And so the whole episode, Stewie was sure that Brian was going to return that. And so that fear and anxiety is always in the air. But guess what? We do want to be in relationship with you, but you have to show from your own life that you are willing to sacrifice. And I don't see that. If you're coming to dance on my land.
Yeah, that's right.
Or to go into the Dollar Tree to get some paint to put on your face.
That's right.
We have to hold each other as sacred, my friends.
The word trust got used here. So
Trust.
What does trust mean? Or how do you, trust is something that has to be earned, finally. So do we have enough proximity to people's lives where we know that in terms of violence and rape culture,
Yes.
the most raped women in the country are on reservations.
That's right.
Because of the way the legal systems are set up, they're the most vulnerable. And people tend to trust you when they believe you care about what's happening in their lives, when you care about what's happening to them every day. And that requires relationship and proximity. And then I think trust is built up over that.
That's right. Thank you.
Our next question is, how do we counteract the moneyed interests that support voter suppression and the fake news of media by a racist right wing? Mr. Wallis, I suspect we could start with you.
Well, there is an active effort going on now, led by Washington, not just overlooked by Washington in states, but led by Washington on voter suppression. Watch this voter fraud commission that the president is about to release. The voter fraud commission is a fraud, and it's intended to lay the foundation for voter suppression. And when you are fearful of how the changing demographic of your country will impact you politically, you create a strategy that includes things like gerrymandering of congressional districts, because the demographic is changing, but the geography keeps a lot of things in place. So gerrymandering is a strategy for not letting our changing demographic change our politics. Voter suppression is going to be not something that happens in North Carolina. The Justice Department opposes. They're going to have a strategy for suppressing votes for the next election from Washington. Why is there a big debate over whether the Dreamers should get citizenship or not? Because there's 800,000 votes, you know? So this is, I've had this vision for years of that on election day, that the polls are full not just of lawyers trying to do good things and protect people, but clergy, church people in those polling places, supporting people who are voting, long lines of people voting, food and water, and bring the church choir out to sing to people and keep them in line. And there, where a clergy person is alongside a lawyer and says, "Is there a problem here?" When he's got his collar on, you know, she has her collar on. So to me, we have to, as faith communities, get directly involved in the voter suppression issue, not just leave it to the lawyers, but become involved ourselves. So how do we understand why people are afraid of demographics changing political policy, and how they're in a strategic plan now to prevent demographics from changing politics?
Jim, I just want to add one more thing. You're 100% right, and what's going on with that commission is horrific. And the judicial system is dealing with some of it, but certainly not enough. But there's even something more basic going on. People just have to vote, period. okay? Half this country did not vote. Less than half of that half voted for our current president. The election was decided by a population less than the size of Lambeau Field in Green Bay. It shouldn't have even been that close. Okay? Even if you have to you don't like the candidate, they're not the perfect candidate in the world, guess what? If this election didn't teach us that there actually is a better than the lesser than the two evils, I don't know what election will. Okay? When people saw, was Hillary a perfect candidate? No, she wasn't a perfect candidate. But look what we got. I mean, just get real. If you don't like the person and they're not the exact perfect person that you want to vote for, but they are a lot better than the other choice, I think we've learned that there is a far lesser than the evils. We need to vote, and we need to do so not repeatedly, but we need to do so intensively. There's no reason why this last election should be decided by 77,000 votes. It shouldn't have even been that close. With voter suppression, it should have been a blowout. But the fact that so many people sat on the sidelines is one of the key reasons why we're in this position. So voter suppression, critical, but we got to go out and vote and do it a year from now.
And it's also easier to vote in a lot of other countries than here. Let's make it as easy as possible.
Should be on the weekends. It shouldn't be during work. Absolutely.
All right.
We'll make this our last question, sadly, but also fortunately, because you're going to have an opportunity to get some books signed out in the lobby. What we're going to wrap up with is, I think, also an excellent question, and that is, I am a white male teacher in one of the most diverse high schools in Washington. What is a good way to start a conversation with my students and colleagues about race and equality? Whoever would care to tackle.
I don't know about starting it, but I want to interject this thought. One of the things that's so interesting to me is a Zora Neale Hurston quote. And she said, "There's no damnation behind my eyes." And one thing that I want to say is that I am no one's victim, and that my grandmother is no one's victim. If you ask my grandmother about her raising, she was born in 1930 in Lower Alabama, the other LA. And she made it to Columbus, Georgia at 4. But my grandmother will tell you, we lived in a beautiful house on a beautiful tree-lined street. And we had what we needed. We didn't have everything, but my mom, she could cook anything. And it was delicious. I could still taste her food. And she will talk about how she got married and raised a family who was a military family, and how she didn't have to deal with all that old mess because she in the military, you didn't experience as much. And so one of the things I want to say is that, yes, this is something we need to tackle. Yes, this is something that is detrimental to many people, but let's get to the hope part. Because there is something sinister in the belief that there are permanent victims that are just distraught and not living. When I met Edward Wood, who's the last person alive who saw the burning bus in Anniston, Alabama this year, he said to the young people from my church, "I've had a good life. I own a home. I had a wife who recently passed away. I have children." And so I think it's important to have a full circle discussion. That there is something, Matthew Johnson wrote a book around the tragic vision. There is something that happens when you go through the valley of the shadow of death. You burst through with joy. And my grandmother, 86 years old, is joyful today. Because she has a granddaughter, 2 granddaughters who will have their doctorates. She has living in a beautiful home with the view of Lake Washington. She has lived well despite the fact that racism sought to kill her every day. And so I think it's important to have a full circle conversation that there are folks who are living despite what this country has tried to do to them.
Yeah.
There is a video that I just watched a few days ago that was produced by MTV, and the person who was leading the interview was Jose Antonio Vargas. He's a Filipino man, and that is undocumented, and was working at high, well, somewhere in the media. I can't remember where, but the video that he produced is called White. And the thing, and I ask each of you to go and watch it because it's very, very compelling. But they went to an Indian reservation in South Dakota, and all of the students were Native students, and they had white teachers. And they engaged them in the discussion and asking the students, how did they feel about having a white teacher, and what did it mean? And so I ask you to go and watch that.
Thank you.
So I just want to encourage us to remember, and this is somewhat along the lines of what Kelle said in the last question. When we say the word conversation, as white folks, sometimes we think conversation is like 50-50, like they're going to talk a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit. And then unfortunately, the way the conversation goes is a lot of times white folk talk more, and they talk first. And so maybe the way, I mean, I've been agitated about this. I've had friends, like basically put me up against the wall and say, hey buddy, like, look, you got to learn something here. And the thing that they were trying to teach me is how to listen. So let's just start asking some questions and then just sit and listen and not be defensive and not try to like justify ourselves, but just listen. And so I think if more of us could listen, I think we'd be able to see the human being in each other in a whole different way.
Mm-hmm. And Pastor Terry, I think great minds think alike, because that's exactly what was going through my head, was that what my advice for that teacher would be to listen more, listen to the students, and have it be a two-way learning experience. And also knowing that right now, today, we're lucky in that we have so many resources available online, in print, and otherwise. There are so many resources for every single person to learn on their own, for whether it's white privilege, whether it's racism, any of these kinds of issues can be sort of gleaned, and there's resources to teach them in schools. And the point that I would make is to bring in speakers, bring in some people from minority communities to be speakers in the classroom, feature guest speakers to a classroom if you want to have a conversation about some of these points. And then the additional point I would make is that right now, for the American Muslim community at least, we are seeing some of the highest levels of bullying and discrimination that kids, American Muslim youth, are facing in schools. And 1 out of 4 instances of that for American Muslims happens at the hands of teachers and school administrators.
Absolutely.
That is disturbing and sickening. So that's the part that I would ask teachers especially to focus on. And I would ask everybody to sort of use sort of whatever potential and possibility we all have to reach out and make sure that schools are in fact safe for minorities, for marginalized communities, especially at this time, whether it's American Muslims, whether it's undocumented sisters and brothers, whether it's black sisters and brothers, whoever it may be. This is the time for all of us to step up and protect our children. Mm-hmm. That is what's really important right now. That's what I would tell them.
Yeah. I just say, I think the resources question, there are resources now that are amazing, and you can find them. What sojo.net tries to do is put resources out all the time. So resources there, Antonio Vargas' pieces, I agree, it's worth. But your point, I think, about a view of minority cultures, back to school night at my son's high school 2 nights ago. I went to the class that he talks about every night when he comes from school. It's called Multicultural Literature in a high school. And this young Hispanic teacher is teaching these kids. And in our meeting with him, he said, one of my students came up and said, why do you look at multiculturalism always through the lens of oppression? Which is the point you're making, through the lens of oppression. Because not everything is about oppression. It's about multiculturalism, right? And so he was making a very powerful point. And so I think young people learn a lot by stories, by hearing people's stories. That's why the speakers thing is such a good idea. Bring people in to tell their stories. And my son, he said to me, I know, Dad, you and Mom write books, and that, you know, that can change some things, but I'm going to be a videographer, because video is what really changes things, you know? So visual storytelling by ordinary people, like you were just saying about your grandmother, that's what changes us. And I think a teacher could really go back to what you started with at the beginning of this night, was quoting that text from John. You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And for a religious leader, or for a teacher, or for a mentor, that's what you want. You want to, and you don't act like you already know it. You got to listen to a lot of other people's stories to learn what the truth is. But knowing the truth, wouldn't a teacher love to be known as the teacher who helped their students know the truth? So that, as you said so well before, so we could all be free. That's right. So let us know the truth so we can all be free.
Amen.
This has, without question, been an extraordinary 2 hours, hasn't it? It's gone fast. Our sincere thanks to each of our panelists, certainly to Jim Wallis for your insights, your thoughtful participation, but also to each of you in the audience for your participation. We wish we could have gotten to each of your great questions. We thank you for your caring, your passion, your willingness to enlist in the work, and as we heard pointed out, your willingness to listen. Before you get up from your seats, let me remind you that concession stands do remain open. Book sales will be conducted in the main lobby. The traffic out there is no better than it will be a few minutes later, so give yourself some time. Book sales will be conducted in the main lobby. Jim Wallis has graciously agreed to sign his books, and some of Father William Treacy's books will also be available. If you ordered a book prepaid with your ticket, do remember to pick up your copy. I'd like to mention at this time that the Treacy Levine Center has redeveloped the Challenge program, inviting faith and community leaders to offer perspectives on current issues. The first episode, From Me to We, From Them to Us, was taped 2 weeks ago and will shortly be available as both an audio or a video podcast on our website at tracylevine.org, on our YouTube channel, and also on the Seattle College's cable TV website, scctv.net, shortly on Comcast Channel 28 and Wave Broadband Television Channel 19. Sign up for our email. You'll get the chance when you go out to get more news on these programs and certainly events similar to tonight. I close with a quote from St. Augustine that I believe speaks to the spirit of tonight. What we cannot do without God, God will not do without us. Thank you, and good night.